Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about all of life through the prism of food, and this week we're pairing it with wine. With Cindy-Marie Harvey, whose beautiful book, Watercress, Willow and Wine, is all about English varieties. And she has some top tips for Christmas.
You know, you're having your sparkling for breakfast anyway in your Jim Jams with your smoked salmon, and that goes so well with sparklings. And then if you're having something sort of seafoody to begin with, you could put it with either a nice crisp Bacchus or maybe an Albarino, something like that.
Cindy-Marie takes us into a revolution in English wine as we tour some of the Southeast's most exciting vineyards. But as she points out, grapes on English soil have been here since the Romans.
What did the Romans ever do for us? Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing is that, you know, we're really going through a renaissance, and the bit that really impresses me, I think, is that for those of us who live and breathe the wine trade, it's kind of an accepted thing. But what we forget is there's the rest of the UK, that the majority of them either don't know we make good wine in the UK, or some of them who know a little bit think we only make sparkling, that we don't make still. And there's just so many people who are out there, would like to know more about it and don't know what's on their doorstep.
And that is what your book does. It is very, very clear about how to pair with food, for example, and we'll go into that in a minute. But you just go through the basics so that we don't need to know too much about wine. You know, I've been on trips across California to the Sonoma Valley and Napa Valley, and I've been through Bordeaux on press trips. It's been amazing. And there's so much information about wine that I feel a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm thinking, oh God, I just don't get it. You kind of cut through all that, a little bit like a sparkling with the fat of fish and chips.
Ooh, I'm liking that.
Thanks, pick that up from your book. To just get to what we really need to know. Is that what you intended to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my big things that I really hate in this world, and I know that everyone could be to a little bit more or less guilty of this, me included, is wine snobbery. You know, drinking good wine and eating good food for me is just one of life's essentials. So anybody who does anything that takes that away by intimidating somebody else and playing that one-upmanship game, I think should just be basically slapped around in the face with a wet haddock. You know, they really shouldn't be allowed to do it. It's just not fair. The great thing about wine is that whatever you like is good. You know, no one else can tell you any different, and we all have different taste buds. We all drink at different levels of price point. For different people, it's different things. Some people, a glass of fizz represents a real big celebration. For other people, it's the thing on a Friday night to signify beginning of the weekend, chill out. They don't even need to know that much about it. They know that they enjoy it. So that was a bit of the sort of the destigmatization, if you like, of wine. You know, it should be fun. That's the basic bottom line.
Let's also put it into perspective. People all over the world will have a little glass of something lovely from the land around them with every single meal. It is good for you. It's very much part of the Mediterranean diet. It's been drunk by peasants and noble people. Going back to the Romans, the great amphoras of wonderful wines from the land. It is about as local and seasonal as to your typical Neapolitan as pizza, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why you look very often at the classic wine and food pairings. And whilst I like changing, sort of like ringing the changes a bit, you look at things like, for example, where Sancerre grows. You know, you've got these wonderful wines, they were nice and crisp and they go really well with, guess what, the local goat's cheese. You know, things that are on your doorstep normally would be arranged that they go well with it. So if you want to be in Piemonte, for example, especially at the moment, if you can afford it, white truffle season. You know, white truffles are the
just come back from Turin, actually. Yeah.
I am so jealous. You have no idea. To be fair, I am going there in a week's time. But yeah, the best thing for me in the world is putting a glass of Nebbiolo, and it doesn't have to be, you know, the top single cru Barolo or whatever. Even just a Nebbiolo delle Langhe with white truffles is just sublime. So
which
things that grow together.
What I had this time last week.
Ooh, where did you go?
Fontana Freda.
Oh, yeah.
In the King's Hunting Lodge. Barolo and truffles, absolutely amazing. What do you think about Fontana Freda?
Oh, Fontana Freda's lovely because there's so much history there. You know, the Bella Rosine, who was, you know, the king's lovely mistress on the side, so he gave her a rather nice estate to have and play around with.
And a tunnel to get to her. Under the castle.
Well, one must try and, protect the niceties in this life. But yeah, Fontana Freitas had a very sort of different history over the years. I think then, of course, it got lost in paid off as a gambling debt, I think, at one point by her son.
And now more than ever, with climate change and the cost of living crisis, that drinking and eating from the land, understanding what's right under our noses is so important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people are open to finding out more about it. They want to know more about it. But this whole sort of globalization that we've somehow backed ourselves into means that we tend to ignore what we have just down the road. I mean, I had the most amazing thing the other day of, I think we all very defensively about, whatever we have is the best. So, if you're in Scotland, we've got the best steak. If you're in Argentina, it's the best steak there, etc. And I went to do a press launch actually in London for the Foreign Press Association. So I had a load of Italian journalists turn up and I said, well, we're going to be doing British charcuterie. I think you could probably have heard the laughter from there to Edinburgh. And then at the end of it, when they'd all tasted this amazing chestnut smoked copper that's made here in the UK by Tempest Foods, they all went, where do we buy this? And to actually have those Italians give their kind of like blessed approval of something which they considered was theirs and nobody else could make outside of Italy, that is something I find is really amazing. So it's just teaching people, like you say, what they have around us and on our own doorstep.
Yeah. And we do have it on our own doorsteps. You've got a lovely map, beautiful illustrations in your book, by the way.
Thank you.
I know that you found your illustrations. Do you want to give her a little bit of a name check?
Absolutely. Chloe Robertson, who is divine, and I love her to pieces. And I found her simply because I was just Googling, as one does. And I really liked her style, and I thought, that's really what I like. And then I sort of looked at where she's actually based, and she's 3 miles down the road from me.
Meant to be.
So she's also South Downs. And so it was very much about keeping the book focused on the UK. It's like it was printed in the UK. We didn't send it elsewhere. So, it was keeping about a very much a local focus on everything from illustrations across the board.
And that map really gives us a sense that certainly southern England is really full of the most incredible vineyards. Now, I know that this is largely due to climate change, so there's two sides of the coin here, and we will go into that. But just give us a name check. Just go round that map, just to tell us some of the top vineyards that we might recognise from the supermarket shelves.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at sort of you starting, I think it's the range along the south coast. So if you go down right to the Isles of Scilly, you've got a vineyard on the Isles of Scilly, St. Martin's down there. They make amazing, lovely, great refreshing wines. And actually, interestingly, the people who run it, James and Holly, they're vegans. And so when we came to doing the pairing, they said, would you mind having a vegan recipe? I'm like, absolutely not. So then we started talking to the chef who works their local pub, who was doing supper clubs for them with vegan recipes. Turns out her parents own a vineyard in New Zealand, so it's all very connectively. But if you go through, coming up through, obviously you've got Camel Valley that so many people have heard about.
That's the Cornwall.
Raymond Blanc's a big fan. Cornwall, exactly. Coming through Dorset, you've got Langham, who won Best Sparkling Wine in the World a couple of years ago. Then coming through into Hampshire, well, there's just so many around me. I'm so lucky to live in Hampshire. Coates and Celia is one that perhaps not an awful lot of people know, but the ones in the trade, in the restaurant trade, know it. It's listed at the Georges V in Paris, which I think means they're doing something okay. Then we've got sort of smaller vineyards like Danebury. Danebury, a real boutique little one, and they make the most beautiful Madeleine Angevin, a white variety made for the summer. And then you go through Sussex with the bigger names. You've got Ridgeview, obviously you've got Nightimber, and then going over into Kent, obviously with Chapeldown and Simpsons over there. So there's a whole host of them. But what I wanted to do was just go, yeah, there are the big guys, but there's also quite a lot of really interesting things. Going back to your Romans, there's people making Bacchus aged in amphora on the Jurassic coast. I mean, it's slightly surreal, but it works and it's amazing.
Yeah, and Bacchus is the one variety that you really rate, don't you?
I really like it. I think that we mustn't become a one-horse pony and sort of say this is it. But the trouble is when you are talking to in the entire world and all the wines come from everywhere, whether it be Mexico or whatever, you need occasionally to start off your launch, you need a flagship variety. And I think that will do it for England, for Bacchus for the moment. But that having said, the Chardonnay that we're producing here is spectacular, especially some down in Kent at Kitts Coty, which is wonderful. And then you've got all the other different varieties everyone's starting to play around with. You know, we've got Albarino grown here, for heaven's sake. Yeah, it's just, you know, it's amazing. And it's just going to get better and better and grow and grow.
Well, yes, so you say, but it is climate change that is providing the environment for it. So let's talk about that. So on the one hand, we are suffering from global warming, but it means that it is a better environment for the vines. And 2018 produced that incredible summer of 2018 that just went on and on and on. I mean, the vineyards are still talking about that, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think everyone was holding their breath because it was just so perfect. Everyone was just waiting for the one thing that went wrong, and it never happened. It was absolutely phenomenal. You know, we are still a marginal climate, so there will be a lot of vintage variation in the UK. I think the difference that we've had is how we're actually adapting to it. So whilst it's always been sparkling, which was fine, because obviously for sparkling, being a marginal climate doesn't matter because you're bringing your grapes in with higher acidity. What will slightly be more complicated, shall we say, is producing still wines year in, year out without huge vintage variation. But climate change will assist that, and it will help.
Yeah, and it comes at a very good time. There's a lot of consciousness about sustainability, about doing the right thing by the climate, carbon capture. There's new information coming in all the time. I mean, I'm going over to Bolney tomorrow for a lovely lunch at their fantastic restaurant looking out over the vineyards there.
Oh, I was there last week.
Sure you were. And, you know, there's no waste there. They use their grape skins to create gins and byproducts. There's very little intervention, the kind of the fertilisers, the pesticides that farmers would just always use, you know, 20 years ago. People are coming to their wine growing with a very different sensibility, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Wine GB have been absolutely brilliant at establishing the sustainability. So there is a separate section now which you can sign up to as a winery. There's a whole host of sustainable criteria that you have to look at before you can actually qualify. And it does mean that you as a consumer can look out there and go, actually, that's great because I might like the taste of your wine, but if I know that actually it's doing something negatively damaging to the environment, that's not so great. So people are aware about this when they're buying things because we do have a choice, and putting that information out to them. And it's a bit like you're saying, going back to the beginning, for most people, the level of technical knowledge of what happens in a winery is either over their head or they're simply not interested, and why should they be, as long as what's in the glass is what they want to drink. You know, let's not make it too complicated. But by putting that stamp saying this is a sustainable winery, and it comes from everything. If you look at, for example, in a winery at harvest time, the amount of water that you need just to keep everything clean, it is a phenomenal amount. For example, sort of say you did 1 litre of wine, you probably need 10 litres of water, that kind of balance. So a lot of things are looking also at their wastage of water and how they can actually recycle that and reuse it. You've mentioned obviously the pips and the skins, you know, whether it goes into producing a distillate or whether it goes off into a beauty product, you know, it doesn't matter as long as it gets reused. So yeah, I think there is a great interest from consumers, and thankfully it's coming from the wineries as well, as they're ahead of the game, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And Will Davenport, who's about 10 minutes up the road from where I am in East Sussex, you know, won one of the biggest sustainable wine awards for his wine. And that is a fantastic achievement for an organic wine. But it's not just that it's organic. He told me that he uses and has always used the local community to pick.
Yeah,
I asked
absolutely.
him, you know, when I was doing something on him for the Delicious podcast, how Brexit was going to affect him, because it was just before Brexit at that time. And he said, well, actually, we've always used the local pickers. And, you know, people, grandparents and their grandchildren come and they help pick, and they always have done. So, you know, it's not just about carbon capture. It's not just about the not using pesticides and being totally organic. It is also about that kind of sense of community, which, again, goes right back to the Romans. And, you know, that's exactly how the southern Mediterraneans pick their vines, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we have, when we say sustainable, I think somehow it's become slightly more narrowed down to just purely about the planet, for want of a better word. But the social interaction is just as important. I mean, I think for me, it comes back to sort of slow food again, about something. Yeah, exactly. It's about that good, clean, fair thing. And the fair bit is the bit that I think for a lot of people, they don't take that much notice of. And, what is the point of eating absolutely delicious rocket produced in Mexico if the people they're employing are not being paid a fair living wage and they don't get any healthcare? I would not be happy eating that, and I don't think most people would.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is, you're very involved with slow food. You were the translator for Carlo Petrini live. How was that?
Oh, gosh, it was petrifying. Genuinely. It was just, one of my best bits of my life, I have to say, it really was quite something. But I said to him beforehand, I said, okay, Carlo, just give me an idea of what we're going to be talking about. And he said, oh, yeah, fine. So he gave me an A4 sheet of paper and there were 3 words on it. And that was it. I was like, okay, that's okay. That's fine. So then I spoke to the MC and he said, look, don't worry, because we've got the then Prince Charles, now King Charles, the then Prince Charles on after him. So I've told him he told him he's got 10 minutes. He's got 15. So you'll be fine. So I stand up there in front of the great and the good, and I'm absolutely trembling because all of my food heroes are there in the audience. And I think it was about an hour and a bit later we stopped. And he just, obviously, he's such a passionate guy, but he just talked and everybody wanted to listen. So it was phenomenal. But yes, I think I had to be sort of caught as I fell off the podium afterwards because I was trembling so much.
And King Charles is also a very big supporter of English wines, isn't he?
Yes, indeed.
I remember going around to, I didn't know it at the time, but I was going around to the composer John Taverner's house for a play date. My kids were at school with his kids. Who knew? I certainly didn't. I was playing downstairs with them and the mum, and suddenly this amazing music was coming from upstairs. And I said to the mum, what's that music? She said, oh, that's John doing something upstairs. And
as he does, yes.
John Taverner kind of wafted down this fantastic staircase and said, I've just been to Ridgeview with Prince Charles. Anybody fancy cracking open a couple of bottles? And we spent the afternoon drinking this amazing Ridgeview, which was then later, as you say in the book, presented at several of the Queen's major functions.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think what the Roberts family, they really were so fundamentally in taking English sparkling wine to a greater audience, and definitely abroad as well. So not only in the sense of a physicality of being abroad, but all of the top diplomats and all of the top politicians were coming here and they're tasting English sparkling wine. Absolute credit to the royal household for doing that. I know that they've got their own wine, which they have made for them on Windsor. But actually, if you think of some sort of huge event and then discovering that the wine you're actually drinking comes from England as well, that's quite something.
Exactly. Let's start going through your food moments, because each of the vineyards that you choose to talk about, you add some recipes to go particularly with their wines. Before we start going through those food moments, give us some of the top tips. I picked up on the sparkling wine with the fish and chips. Start with that. Why would that go so well?
Well, it's just, although I said, it's great fun to experiment, there are actually some scientific reasons to why different foods go with different wines. There's actually the physical components within them that actually will either make them taste better or worse. And when you're tasting sparkling wine with anything that is fried, literally the acidity will cut through sort of that real sort of cloyingness of the fryness, and it will brighten the food as well. So there is no better pairing for sparkling wine in my mind than really freshly just fried fish and chips, preferably sat on a beach, sort of an evening in July in Lyme Regis. But, it really is one of the world's greatest things. And most people would go, why would you put sparkling with, because sadly there is still this conception that sparkling wines are only to be drunk on high days and holidays. But I am a great believer that over the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of change in that and people actually understanding that sparkling wines can go through an entire meal. Yeah. And therefore, this is something not just to be drunk as an aperitif, then put aside and go to the still stuff, but you can actually drink it throughout. So, yeah. You
mentioned a Gewürztraminer with spice. I was told that a long time ago. I've kind of always tried to stick to it, a Riesling or a Gewürztraminer. Why?
Simply because of the level of, sometimes it is the level of residual sugar that might be in the wine. And that's the thing that has everybody always throwing their hands up and going, oh, I don't like sweet wine. It's not sweet. It just has more texture and it has more body. For example, the New Zealanders are thinking about putting the residual sugar levels on the back of their bottles, because simply they think it's actually a good thing to know rather than negative. But mainly it's because of the actual flavour profile of those grape varieties, especially Gewürztraminer, which is so spicy. Gewürz, obviously, meaning spice, and Traminer being the village it came from. So Gewürztraminer, the spicy one from the village of Tramin. So the moment you start putting that together with the spice in a dish, it kind of echoes each other. But the actual texture of the wine, because it very often does have a little bit of residual sugar in it, will actually carry through the spice because it won't let it burn as much. It will round it out in your mouth. So it comes as a balance from two different directions.
And roast chicken and a slightly oaked Chardonnay.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it.
Yeah, exactly. If you think about doing sort of a very classic roast lunch, and don't mess around with it too much, just, throw a lemon inside it, put a few herbs, lots of salt on it, and some butter, job done. And then traditionally it always used to be obviously with white Burgundy. White Burgundy was the classic combination. Whereas now, obviously, thinking about English wines, you can look at Litmus, for example, from John Warrenshak, who makes amazing. It's a blend, actually, of Chardonnay and back other things. But also, if you look at the Chardonnays that have been made in Kent as well, anything that's got that lovely structure and the oakiness that isn't dominant, I think that's the key. We have benefited in the UK of learning what's gone on in the world in the last sort of 20, 30 years. And we have much better oak management. So we're never going to hopefully go back to the 80s of the Australian oak tea bag, which was like chewing on a, basically stick of just awful, dreadful oak, and you couldn't taste any wine. It was just really, really bad.
What about Christmas?
Christmas is good because it depends what you're going to have, and I think that's the big problem with Christmas, is that you've got so many different flavours on your plate, generally speaking, if we're going to go for a classic Christmas lunch. So people go, do I go white or do I go red? Part of me would go,
both.
Yeah, definitely.
It's an all-day thing.
Exactly. You can work you right the way through. You're having your sparkling for breakfast anyway, and your Jim Jams with your smoked salmon, and again, so oily fish with your smoked salmon.
Yeah.
So that goes so well with sparklings. And then going through, if you're having something sort of seafoody to begin with, you could put it with either a nice crisp Bacchus or maybe an Albarino, something like that. Moving on. The main course, shall we say, if you're going to be doing turkey's one of those meats that it quite happily pairs with either. So if you wanted to stay with white, go across to something that's got a bit more body, like a Chardonnay. Or if you were going to go for the reds, classically in the past I've gone for sort of lighter reds from the Loire, like Bourgogne and Chinon and things like that. But now I'm looking at the Pinot Noirs that are being produced in the UK, especially things like Lyme Bay, from right down on the Devon-Dorset border, which just is bursting with cranberry red fruit. And I use that word advisedly because I think it would just go amazingly well on a Christmas lunch. So there's all kinds of different things you could put together. Yeah. But of course you've got the big sort of punchy flavours of stuffing and whatever. So it's just sort of picking out a few flavours and thinking, yeah, that will really go with that.
Yeah.
And obviously not whacking too much alcohol into the gravy too early, because that just kills everything, possibly the chef as well.
Let's start going around the country. You've chosen 4 vineyards out of many in your book. First, why did you choose Nutbourne first?
Nutbourne because, for me, they're just down the road from me. I have visited them lots and lots of times, and I absolutely adore the kind of ethos there, the family ethos. It's very much about hands-on, getting into the vines. Peter Gladwin, of course, obviously is a chef in his own right. He runs a great catering company in London that does things like the Lord Mayor's Banquet. He's got several cookbooks of his own. So every time we go there on a tour and take people there for a tasting and then have lunch in their lovely little lodge next to this ancient old windmill, it's just one of the most beautiful places to be. And Peter's got like the pizza oven going, and he's blasting some mackerel or something so it gets nice and blackened. And for me, it was one of the first times in the UK I thought, here is somebody who really understands putting food and wine together. And especially when I sat and they do picnics there. So it's all about local Sussex things. Obviously, they have the Nutbourne tomato estate, which is next to them, just down the road, which are very famous. Absolutely, exquisitely, just bursting with flavour. But everything they put in those little picnics is, again, it's back to the sustainability of having bamboo knives and forks and things. But also, it just comes locally. So whether it's like the smoked trout patty that's made down the road, everything is from there. Yeah. And I just sat there actually with Chloe, my illustrator, when I took her to see some vineyards when we were thinking about doing the book. And we sat up on the top of the ridge looking down. You'd have thought you were in New Zealand. It was just spectacularly beautiful, and vines as far as the eye could see.
Same as Rathfinny, which is 10 minutes in a different direction from where I am. Overlooking the Cradle Valley down towards the sea. Absolutely stunning. Again, the local produce around here is sensational. You've got a great day out at some of these places, which are really destinations, aren't they? And that's a really important thing. We will have wine tourism in the southeast.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the drivers were fairly instrumental and very clear in what they wanted to achieve.
That's Sarah and Mark Driver who set it up only 10 years ago, isn't it?
A little bit more, I think, but it's not long. But they poached Chris from the Black Rat in Winchester, who's an amazing chef. And the one thing I like that they've done is this sort of looking outside and what we can actually learn from other wine regions and bringing them back to the UK.
Yeah. So specifically South Africa for them.
Yes, specifically South Africa, but also I would say Australia is the same, and New Zealand to a lesser extent. But in South Africa, you can go to a winery just simply for lunch, because they have a lovely restaurant. It's kind of almost incidental.
Which is why I'm going to Bolney tomorrow.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah,
exactly.
You probably won't go and see any stainless steel or tanks or anything. You'll be having lunch.
Well, exactly. But it's about choosing a really beautiful environment. I mean, it's just 20 minutes outside Brighton. But it's getting these great chefs in and having something delicious while you're looking out over the vineyards themselves so that you have context. It's the absolute lesson in local seasonal.
I think it also, it reaches out. It's that thing about getting people from the wider society into wine and English wine and food, because people will go there because it's lovely food. They won't be going there because they want to learn more about the wine, but they'll look at it and go, oh, actually, you know what? I might buy a gift voucher for my other half to come back and we'll do a tour next time. So it is that way of getting people involved in it in a very gentle, easy way, rather than sort of saying, oh, you have to come and learn because this is on your, it's doing it nicely.
Yeah, exactly. Simpsons in Kent, you've chosen as your second food moment.
Yeah, Simpsons. Well, Simpsons, they are just, I love the fact that they've sort of done everything in the inverse. So they had an estate in the south of France first, make very good Provençal rosés down there. And then afterwards, they decided to come back to Kent and plant in Kent. And I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of their rosé, the Rail Hill rosé. It comes in the most gorgeous bottle. I mean, absolutely stunning bottle. And they also have the glass stoppers on it. So they're all totally recyclable. And when I did an event here at our local deli, Madeline's Kitchen in Petersfield, we had lots of people over and blah, blah, blah. And it was just a lovely, fun evening. And I had that rosé. And although everyone was like, wow, this is beautiful, when I came to do the recycling, there were none of those bottles left. Everyone had taken all the empty bottles home because they all get repurposed as either olive oil bottles or whatever. So again, taking this idea of sustainability to the next level.
Yeah. And you've used the tuna and fennel meatballs recipe to reference the fact that the inspiration does come from all over the world. It's a wonderful time, isn't it, to think globally and act locally.
Yeah, absolutely. That sums it up entirely, because we can never be a sort of standalone, and why would we want to sort of blocking out influences from around the world? That would be the most boring situation ever. So I wanted to be a celebration of English wines, but with stuff that also has inspired me across, 25 years of wandering the wine world. And so, there's this lovely, in the archipelago of the Aeolian Islands, just off the north coast of Sicily. And there's just this lovely family run. It's nothing special. It's just a family-run restaurant. Wine just keeps turning up. The mother does the most amazing stuffed squid, and they came out these days with these sort of tuna meatballs. And I just remember sitting there and going, "Oh, this is heaven. It's absolutely perfect." And you can see the water just lapping up. And most people that go to Salina would go there purely for the beauty and just to relax and go to a nice hotel. But they actually have fantastic wine estates on the island as well, especially making Moscato. So actually taking that kind of thinking, well, I'd love to be able to do that looking out of the sea in the UK in Kent, for example, with a beautiful bottle of Simpsons. but the inspiration came to it from a memory of Italy.
Yeah.
So I think it comes from both sides.
Yeah, a little bit obsessed, can I just say, Cindy-Marie? Third food moment is also an Italian summer's day. You've brought back the baci di dami. Let's go to Italy via Ambriel, West Sussex.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I lived in Italy, and I lived in Piemonte for 5 years, so whenever you went to anyone's house for sort of the late afternoon, I shan't even really call it tea time, one always took a little platter of these lovely mignons, so little patisseries. And you can either have the beignet, which are like little shoe buns, and then pushed in or whatever. And one thing I really loved was the baci di dama. Now, baci di dama are, and by the way, apologies to all Italians ever before anyone says the recipe in my book is not for baci di dama. They just gave me a bit of inspiration. So traditionally made, obviously, with hazelnuts and chocolate, because we're in Piemonte, and that's what we have in Piemonte. So when I was at home and I thought, I'd really like to redo this for the summer. And I had some of those lovely little mini amaretti biscuits, and I had some strawberry ice cream. So I started playing around with that. And the reason that took me back to Ambriel is because Wendy, who's one of the owners, along with her husband Charles at Ambriel, is possibly one of the most welcoming, generous people who works in the wine trade. She has an incredible hospitality. It's just through her veins. And whenever I've been there with clients, it has just felt totally all enveloping. And then being on their lovely garden on a summer's afternoon, especially drinking their demi-sec, which I think surprised a lot of people, because if we'd have said to them, oh, it's demi-sec before they tasted it, they'd have gone, oh no, I don't do sweet wines. But actually it's the most perfect reviving. You've got the sun beating down, it's Sussex at its best. You can hear the water tinkling in the water fountains, and just to sit down and do something like that sums up an English summer for me.
It does. Your fourth food moment takes us to Biddenden Vineyard in Kent, where I've been to for plenty of times. Again, the smell of childhood, the smell of summer, apple orchards. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, I just adore the whole story behind Biddenden, and the fact that obviously because they had these wonderful orchard groves of apples, and then the bottom fell out of the apple market. This was in the sort of like 60s, something like that. And Tom Barnes, who's the current winemaker, his mother was listening in the kitchen to, I think it was Woman's Hour, and there was a piece on English vineyards, and she said, oh, let's do this. And I can just imagine the scene, everybody coming home after a hard day picking apples and thinking, well, we're not going to sell them because there's no money in it. And then she says, let's go and plant a vineyard. There would have been hollow laughter, I feel, for quite a bit of time. However, she has been thus vindicated. And they make some amazing wines. They still obviously have their apples as well. But for me, for pairing, there could be nothing else other than putting it with an apple recipe, because it has to reflect the whole of their history, I think. One of the great things is going to be able to watch is how dessert wines go in the UK, because there are very few at the moment. And some of them are a little bit light and not terribly to my taste.
And is that because it's not hot enough yet?
I think so. I think it's also we don't really have the culture of it. And I think to make sweet wines more than anything else, you really, as a winemaker, have to have absolute passion for it, which Tom Barnes at Biddenden has in spades. So he has their Schönberger, which is the one that I featured in the book, which is also incredibly good value when you look at the price of, Sauternes and things like that. So I would definitely say, going back to the Christmas idea, get yourself some Schönberger from Biddenden, because it will just go with so many different things. Anyone's popping in at 10:30 in the morning for a little bit of a mince pie, give them a glass of Schönberger. They'll be there forever. Admittedly, they will still be there at the end of the day, but that's another problem. So I think generally that what they do there, he also has an amazing other dessert wine, which comes with a slightly crazy price tag, but he did it to make a point, because there are 122, I think it was, grams of residual sugar. So he priced it at £122, just for fun. Just amazing wine, but it's also, you've got to have fun in this as well. So definitely the Biddenden, it's so beautiful there as well. And it really does create that sort of quintessential English, if you like.
Mentioning price, that is the thing that people talk about most. It is expensive. Presumably that means it's because we're not producing enough of it yet, or is it because, are they deliberately targeting a certain kind of wine buyer?
Not really, I don't think. I think some of so if you went for the very top crew of, say, Nye Timber, which is a ridiculous amount of money, very nice, please don't take me the wrong way, but it is outside of most people's idea of what they would ever pay for a meal out for two, let alone a bottle of wine. that is definitely aiming at that market. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, because that's actually how you get the attention of that market. However, for the majority of people who produce wine in the UK, it is sadly just down to the fact that actually it is very expensive to produce in the UK because of the fixed costs that we have, because we don't get any tax breaks from our beloved government, because that we have the unreliability of our vintages. So we can have, 2018 3 times the amount as was produced in the previous year. For an economic point of view, that's a nightmare being able to plan. So it is fundamentally down to that. We could do with a little bit of help from the government, just to get established, because, as you said, we have a cost of living crisis. And whilst there are people out there who don't think too much about what they would spend on wine, for most people, wine is still a luxury. So if they go out there and they see English wine that they'd like to buy and it's too expensive compared to something cheap and cheerful from, say, Slovenia, where there's some amazing wines, but the production costs are a lot less, then we know which one they're going to go for. I do think, though, there are great companies out there trying to do so much for it. And actually, Waitrose gets a shout out for doing as much as they can for the range that they stock. You have Chapel Down, who do have the economics of volume. So they come in at decent prices for everybody. And then you have Lime Bay down in Dorset, Devon, who they worked, I think, with Aldi last year. And so they did sort of under the own label range. I think it was $6.99 or something, 2 wines. Nobody's going to complain about paying that for a bottle of wine, and it's coming from England. So whilst people want to be patriotic, it does also come down to how much it is. So I think as long as it's honestly priced, for example, something like Stoppen's Pinot Blanc, which is £15 a bottle, I'm quite happy with that, because it's an honest price. But we could do with a bit of help, as a tax break. That would be good.
Thanks for listening. You can sign up to my newsletter at gillysmith.com to find out all my news, including supper clubs, and follow me on Instagram at foodgillysmith. And I'll see you next week.